Half his face is gone, and he straightens his tie. Filmed in 19 takes, that image became one of television's most replayed moments. Behind it lives a man whose real name may never be known, whose past was deliberately erased, and whose plan for revenge ran for 20 years. This is the psychology of Gus Fring. Section 1. The Mask. There is a moment in the second season of Breaking Bad that most people barely notice the first time they watch it. Walter White and Jesse Pinkman are sitting in a fast food restaurant, waiting for a meeting that never seems to arrive. They have been told a major drug distributor will make contact, and so they sit there in a booth, watching the door, checking the time, growing more anxious by the minute. The person they are waiting for never shows. Eventually, they give up and leave, convinced they have missed their chance, or that the whole thing has fallen through. What they do not know, what the audience does not know yet, is that the distributor was there the entire time. He had been watching them from the moment they walked in. He had studied the way Jesse moved, clocked his condition, assessed both men against a set of internal standards he would never fully disclose. And then, having seen everything he needed to see, he decided they were not ready for him. And he went back to doing what he had been doing before they arrived, which was cleaning tables, wiping down surfaces, greeting customers with a warm, unhurried smile, running the restaurant floor with the quiet efficiency of someone who does this every day and takes genuine pride in it. His name, according to everything on paper, is Gustavo Fring. He owns a chain of fried chicken restaurants called Los Pollos Hermanos. He is a pillar of the Albuquerque business community. He sits on the hospital board. He donates to law enforcement charities and has built a warm, personal friendship with the head of the local DEA office. He is unfailingly polite, impeccably dressed, and soft-spoken in a way that puts people immediately at ease. He is, by any reasonable measure, exactly what he appears to be. He is also one of the most powerful drug distributors in the southwestern United States, running a methamphetamine operation of a scale and sophistication that the DEA, despite years of effort, cannot seem to find any trace of. The two versions of Gus Fring exist in the same body, move through the same world, and share the same face. Neither one ever slips. What the writers of Breaking Bad understood when they created Gus Fring, and what Giancarlo Esposito understood when he agreed to play him, is that the most frightening kind of dangerous person is the one who feels completely safe to be around. Most fictional villains announce themselves in some way. There is something off, something sharp at the edges, something that makes the people around them uneasy, even when they cannot say exactly why. The audience picks up on these signals and stores them. They know, watching, that this person is a threat. The dramatic tension then comes from watching other characters fail to see what the audience can already see. Gus Fring dismantles this entirely. There is no signal. There is no edge. There is nothing to pick up on and store away. He presents a version of himself to the world that is so thorough, so genuinely inhabited, so free of any visible seam or crack, that even a veteran DEA agent sitting across a table from him walks away satisfied. The mask, in other words, is so good that it barely functions as a mask at all. It functions as a face. Understanding how that works psychologically is the real project when it comes to Gus Fring, because what the show asks the audience to think about, over time, is a question that turns out to have no clean answer. Which version of this man is real? Is the calm, courteous restaurant owner a disguise worn by a cold and calculating criminal? Or is the criminal the truth, and the public figure a performance? Or is it possible that both are fully real at the same time? two entirely coherent selves sharing a single life, neither one less genuine than the other. The concept that psychologists use when they talk about this kind of internal division is called compartmentalization. It describes a mental process in which a person holds different parts of their life, their values, their actions, and their self-image in separate containers that do not touch each other. A person who compartmentalizes well does not experience the friction that would normally come from contradiction. They do not feel the weight of holding two incompatible truths. Each compartment is sealed off from the others, and within each compartment, everything is consistent and whole. The person who hurts people at work goes home and is a loving parent. The person who lies in one relationship tells the truth in every other. The categories do not bleed. In Gus Fring, this capacity is taken to an almost clinical extreme. He runs a drug empire of staggering complexity, oversees acts of extreme violence, and operates a distribution network that has corrupted or endangered dozens of people. He also genuinely cares about the quality of the food his restaurants serve. He is not performing when he pulls a fry cook aside and, with meticulous patience, explains exactly how the preparation process should go. He is not pretending when he greets a regular customer by name or makes sure the dining area is immaculate. That part of him is real. The satisfaction he takes in running a good restaurant is genuine. Both things are true, and they do not cancel each other out. Because inside the architecture of his mind, they were never in the same room. What makes this psychologically interesting is that compartmentalization of that order does not come from nowhere. It is built. It is practiced. It is the result of a life that demanded it, that rewarded it, that perhaps depended on it for survival. Gus Fring was not born knowing how to be two people at once. He learned. And understanding what taught him that is a large part of understanding who he is. The show gives very little directly. What it offers instead is a portrait assembled from small, careful details. The way Gus holds himself, the economy of his movements, the precision with which he chooses his words in every interaction, the fact that he drives a 1998 Volvo, an ordinary, aging car that would attract no notice from anyone, that says absolutely nothing about wealth or power or ambition. The fact that he does not eat at the cartel boss's compound when every other man in the room is eating, because he is the one who has poisoned the food, and he needs a few seconds in the bathroom with a finger down his throat to purge the small amount that will buy him those crucial extra minutes. Every detail is chosen. Nothing is accidental. The life he presents to the world is an architecture, designed to spec, load-tested, and maintained with the obsessive care of someone who knows exactly what would happen if any part of it failed. That obsessiveness is one of the most consistent things about him. The showrunners and writers talk about Gus as someone who approaches every aspect of his existence with the same level of discipline. It is not that he works hard. Lots of people work hard. It is that he applies the same standard to a trash bag left in the wrong place in his restaurant kitchen as he applies to a decision about how to neutralize a threat to his entire operation. The scale changes. The standard does not. Whatever the task in front of him, Gus Fring brings his full, undivided, and extremely exacting attention to it. This is a man for whom half measures do not register as an option. One of the most striking things about the public face Gus presents is that it is not purely defensive. It is not simply a shield held up to keep people away. He uses it offensively. The donations to the DEA, the friendship with the special agent in charge, the seat on the hospital board, the visibility in the Albuquerque business community. None of these things are just about keeping suspicion at bay. They are active moves. By being the well-known, well-regarded community figure who supports law enforcement, Gus gives himself access to information. He knows when investigations are moving in directions that might concern him. He hears things that a man living in the shadows would never hear. The mask is not just a disguise. It is a tool, and like every tool Gus touches, he has found a way to make it do more than one job at once. There is something almost admirable about it, in the way that certain forms of extreme competence are admirable regardless of what they are in service of. This is something the show keeps bumping against deliberately. Gus Fring is easy to respect. He is consistent, disciplined, intelligent, and in his own way, fair. He does not exploit people arbitrarily. He does not enjoy cruelty as an end in itself. When he inflicts harm, there is a reason, and the reason is always embedded in a larger logic that he has thought through carefully. He is not chaotic. He is not impulsive. He does not lose control. And because those qualities are rare enough in anyone, there is a strange pull toward him, even knowing what he is. This is something Giancarlo Esposito has spoken about at length. When he first encountered the character in the script, the line that stopped him was a stage direction describing Gus as someone who was hiding in plain sight. Esposito has said that line hit him with unusual force because he recognized something personal in it. He described himself as someone who had spent much of his life doing something similar, concealing parts of himself for fear that revealing them fully would invite rejection. The character, for Esposito, was not a distant exercise in playing something alien. It was a recognition. That recognition, carried into every performance choice, is a large part of why Gus Fring feels so dense on screen. There is a life behind the eyes that very few performances manage. Esposito found the humanity in the hiding. The flip side of that density is the question that Gus Fring raises quietly, over the course of many scenes, about the nature of identity itself. If a person maintains a public self for long enough, with enough discipline and enough genuine investment, does that self become real? The restaurant manager who genuinely cares about his employees, who takes pride in the quality of his product, who shows up every day and does the work with full attention. Is that person less real than the one who orders violence in a back room? Does the violence make the warmth false? Does the warmth make the violence impossible to square? Or do both simply coexist, the way contradictions often do in actual human beings, held together by the same mind without ever being resolved? Gus never resolves them. The show never resolves them on his behalf. What happens instead is that the two versions of him are slowly revealed in parallel, and the audience is left to hold both without a clean explanation. This is what distinguishes him from most television antagonists. The show does not reduce him. It accumulates him, layer by layer, until what is sitting in front of the audience is something genuinely complex. A person who is completely terrible and completely understandable at the same time. The other element that makes the mask so effective, both as a psychological phenomenon and as a piece of dramatic writing, is discipline over emotion. Gus Fring shows what he chooses to show. In moments of extreme provocation, extreme danger, extreme grief, his face does what he decides it should do. There is a psychological concept sometimes called strategic emotional control. The deliberate management of one's own emotional expression, not because the feelings are absent, but because their display has been weighed and found inadvisable. Gus does not suppress his emotions in the clinical sense. He regulates them with extraordinary precision, allowing through only what serves the moment. When he needs to appear concerned, he appears concerned. When he needs to appear pleased, he appears pleased. When he feels things that should not be visible, they are simply not visible. The single most significant crack in this composure comes in a flashback that appears in the 4th season of Breaking Bad. A much younger Gus, more open-faced, more readable, sits at the edge of a swimming pool while someone he loves bleeds into the water. In that moment, the controlled surface breaks entirely. What comes through is pure grief, unmanaged and undirected, the face of a person who has not yet learned to contain it. After that moment, the Gus who appears in the rest of the show is the product of what happened next. The discipline, the precision, the mask, all of it was built in the years that followed. The grief did not go away. It went underground, where it has been running everything ever since. That is the deepest truth about the psychology of Gus Fring. The calm is real. The composure is real. The patience is real. But underneath all of it, still moving, still shaping every decision, is something that has never healed. The mask was built over a wound, and the wound is what the mask was always really for. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. A man of two complete and fully inhabited selves, held together by extraordinary discipline and something much older than ambition. Underneath the warm smile and the pressed shirt, a wound was running everything. The story of how it got there begins in a country he left behind, and a past so carefully erased that even the people paid to find it came back empty-handed. Section 2. The Man Without a Past. No birth records, no school records, no government documents of any kind that confirm Gustavo Fring ever existed before he arrived in Mexico in 1986. Hank delivers this the way a detective delivers information he wants to watch someone react to, studying the face across from him for any sign of disturbance, any flicker of recognition that something important has just been said. Gus does not flicker. He nods, as though the information is mildly interesting rather than potentially catastrophic, and explains, with the patient courtesy of a man who has given this answer before, that the Pinochet government was notoriously unreliable when it came to record-keeping. Documents were lost. Archives were incomplete or destroyed. It was, he says, simply the nature of that particular administration. He says all of this with such calm, such professional reasonableness, that the agents around the table accept it almost immediately. Only Hank, sitting back and watching, is not quite satisfied. But even Hank cannot say exactly why. There is nothing to point to. The explanation is plausible. The manner is flawless. And Gustavo Fring drives home in his aging Volvo without a scratch on him. This scene does something that the show does repeatedly when it comes to Gus's past. It raises the question, shows you how close someone has come to finding an answer, and then pulls back. The curtain lifts an inch, not enough to see through, and then falls again. It is a deliberate creative strategy, and it comes directly from the top. Vince Gilligan, who created Breaking Bad and served as its showrunner, has said in interviews that he made a conscious choice to leave Gus Fring's origins permanently ambiguous. The comparison he has reached for more than once is the briefcase in Pulp Fiction. In that film, the briefcase glows. Everyone wants it. Its contents are the engine of the entire story, and the audience never finds out what is inside. The not knowing is the point. Gilligan felt that spelling out exactly who Gus was in Chile would reduce him, would give him edges and limitations that the mystery does not have. So the mystery stayed. What that means in practice is that everything the audience knows about Gus Fring before 1986 comes from fragments. Hints dropped by other characters, most of them unreliable. Inferences drawn from what Gus himself says in moments where candor might serve him. The occasional detail that surfaces in Better Call Saul and adds a piece without completing the picture. Taken together, these fragments sketch an outline rather than a portrait. But the outline is striking enough that it has generated years of serious analysis from people trying to fill it in. What is established with reasonable certainty is that Gus grew up in Chile during one of the most violent and repressive periods in the country's 20th century history. Augusto Pinochet came to power in 1973 through a military coup that overthrew the democratically elected government of Salvador Allende. What followed was a 17-year dictatorship defined by state violence, mass detention, torture, and the disappearance of thousands of political opponents. The regime maintained a secret police apparatus whose job was surveillance, control, and the elimination of dissent. Records from this period are genuinely incomplete in many cases, both because of administrative chaos and because certain records were deliberately destroyed by people who had reasons not to want them found. So when Gus says the Pinochet government kept poor records, he is saying something that is technically accurate. That is the thing about the best lies. They are usually built around a foundation of true information. The Pinochet regime did destroy records. Archives were incomplete. Documentation was unreliable. All of that is historically real. The question is whether that general truth is being used to conceal a specific one. The detail that keeps surfacing in discussions of Gus's past is the way Hector Salamanca addresses him in a flashback that appears in the first season of Better Call Saul. Hector, contemptuous and mocking, calls Gus Big Generalissimo. The word Generalissimo refers to a commander of combined military forces, a title associated with figures who hold supreme military authority. Used as a taunt, it suggests that Hector knows something about Gus's past in Chile that most people do not. Specifically, it implies a connection to the military, or to the military political apparatus of the Pinochet government. Whether Hector is being precise or simply reaching for the most dismissive label he can find is not entirely clear. But the implication lands. If Gus was connected to the Pinochet regime in some capacity, the most likely fit, based on how his operation runs and how his mind works, is not the military in any conventional field sense. The way Gus structures his criminal enterprise has been compared by more than one analyst to the way an intelligence service operates. He uses surveillance extensively. He runs informants inside organizations he wants to monitor. He is skilled at constructing cover stories that are internally consistent and difficult to disprove. He understands how to move through institutions without leaving traces. He knows how to make people disappear in a bureaucratic sense, how to erase the paper trails that would lead investigators back to him. These are not the skills of a soldier. They are the skills of someone who worked in intelligence. The CNI, the National Information Center, was Pinochet's main internal intelligence agency during the latter part of the dictatorship. Its operatives were involved in surveillance, interrogation, and the coordination of political violence. The agency also maintained international connections, including ties to the CIA, which supported the Pinochet government as part of a broader Cold War strategy of opposing leftist governments in Latin America. If Gus was part of something like the CNI, he would have had access to exactly the kind of operational knowledge that his later career suggests he possesses. He would also have had very good reasons to erase his identity when he left, both to protect himself from people who might hold him accountable for what happened during those years, and to prevent anyone from finding the trail back to who he really was. Don Eladio, the cartel boss who orders Max killed in 1989 and then deliberately spares Gus, says something to Gus at that moment that is among the most loaded lines in the entire show. He tells Gus that he is still alive because Eladio knows who he really is, and adds that Gus is not in Chile anymore. The implications ripple in several directions at once. Eladio is signaling that Gus's background makes him too dangerous to kill casually, that whoever or whatever Gus was in Chile carries enough weight that even a major cartel boss thinks twice before touching him. At the same time, the warning that he is not in Chile anymore suggests that whatever protected him there has limits, that his past influence or connections do not travel fully across borders. Eladio is both acknowledging the power and marking its edge. This is as close as the show ever comes to confirming that Gus had a significant, possibly official role in Chile's political apparatus. The cartel operates in a world where reputations are tracked carefully, and killing the wrong person carries consequences. Eladio is not a man who leaves enemies alive out of sentiment. The fact that he spares Gus while having Max killed right in front of him says something definitive about the weight Gus carries from his past. There is another layer to the Chile question, one that Better Call Saul adds carefully and without ever over-explaining. In the episode known as JMM, Gus is speaking with Peter Schuler, a German businessman who serves as Gus's connection to Madrigal Electromotive, the corporate umbrella that provides legitimate cover for parts of Gus's financial structure. Schuler is panicking, overwhelmed by the pressure of the situation around him, and Gus reaches back into a shared memory to steady him. He reminds Schuler of a time in Santiago when they had their backs against the wall, and says that Peter was the one who got them out. The reference is brief, and the details are entirely withheld. But the picture it sketches is one of two men who survived something together in Chile. Something serious enough that the memory of it can still function as a stabilizing anchor decades later. Lalo Salamanca, in a separate conversation in a different episode of Better Call Saul, refers to a mysterious incident involving Gus that took place in Santiago. He does not elaborate. He does not need to. The mention is enough to establish that something happened there. Something notable enough that even people in the cartel have heard a version of it. What that event was, nobody says. The curtain lifts, the inch of light appears, and then it falls again. What all of this creates, collectively, is a character whose danger is not primarily located in what he does on screen. It is located in the unknown. The audience knows what Gus is willing to do in the present, and that is already significant. But the implication running underneath every scene is that what happened before is darker, larger, and more serious than anything shown. The erased past is not a gap in the character. It is part of the character. The emptiness behind him, the absence of documentation, the way the trail simply stops in 1986, functions as its own kind of presence. Something happened in Chile. Something happened that Gus has spent decades making sure no one can find. And whatever it was serious enough that a drug cartel boss decided to let him walk away from a poolside execution while the man next to him was shot through the head. There is one more dimension to the Chilean background that the show handles with notable restraint and care. Gus's sexuality, which is confirmed by showrunner Peter Gould in 2022 as gay, adds a specific historical weight to his life in Chile. Under the Pinochet regime, consensual same-sex relations were illegal. The dictatorship was explicitly hostile to homosexuality, and the consequences for discovery could be severe. If Gus was gay in Chile during the 1970s and 1980s, he was already living a double life before he ever became a criminal. He was already keeping something hidden, already constructing a public face that concealed a private truth, already navigating a world where the wrong person finding out the wrong thing could have catastrophic results. The discipline he applies to his identity as a businessman concealing a drug empire may have its roots in a much earlier and more personal form of concealment. The man who can maintain two completely separate selves did not learn that skill in Albuquerque. He learned it somewhere darker and more immediate, in a country where the cost of being found out was not DEA surveillance. It was state violence. This reading gives the psychological portrait of Gus Fring an additional layer of depth that the show is careful not to make explicit, but equally careful not to close off. The compartmentalization that defines him was not simply a strategic choice made in service of ambition. It may have been a survival mechanism developed under conditions where survival genuinely required it. The man who hides in plain sight learned to hide from something real, something that had teeth, something that could actually reach him. And that early training, whatever form it took, produced a kind of psychological infrastructure that later became the foundation of an empire. The name itself is almost certainly not his. When Hank asks whether Gustavo Fring is the name he was born with, the show does not answer directly. But the complete absence of any documentation predating his arrival in Mexico, combined with the ease with which Gus deflects the question, strongly suggests that the name is an alias, adopted at some point during or after his departure from Chile. Mike Ehrmantraut, who is introduced in Better Call Saul as someone with a particular set of skills when it comes to finding things that people have tried to hide, is asked by Gus to determine whether any trace of his pre-Mexico life can be located. Mike returns with a finding that is notable not for what it reveals, but for what it confirms. He tells Gus that if he cannot find it, nobody can. The record is clean. Whatever Gus was before 1986, that person, for all practical purposes, no longer exists. The choice to make Gus's past permanently inaccessible is one of the most sophisticated pieces of character writing in either show. Most complex antagonists are explained eventually. The backstory arrives. The formative event is dramatized. The audience gets the scene that answers the question of how someone became this way. With Gus, that scene never comes. What comes instead is the 1989 pool scene, which is the earliest moment in his story that the shows choose to show in any detail. And that scene begins with the wound already present, already formative. The two men arriving at a meeting that will change everything, as though they have already been through something before. The Chile that made Gus Fring remains off-screen, inferred, constructed from fragments by an audience that has been given just enough to keep asking. What Gilligan understood, and what the writing honors consistently, is that the mystery is more frightening than any answer could be. A fully explained Gus Fring is a character with known parameters. An unexplained Gus Fring is a character whose depths have no visible bottom. Every scene he is in carries the weight of a past that no one on screen and no one watching can fully account for. That weight is invisible and constant, and it does exactly what Gus himself does. It hides in plain sight. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The erased past explains the discipline, and the discipline built the empire. But before the empire, there was a single afternoon in Mexico and a man beside a swimming pool whose death set everything in motion. Section 3. The Wound That Never Healed. Before the empire, before the restaurants and the laundry and the underground lab and the 20-year patience, there was a man named Maximino Arciniega. The show calls him Max. He was a chemist, a gifted one, and by the time the audience meets him in a single extended flashback, he has already become the most important person in Gus Fring's life. He is also, within minutes of that flashback beginning, dead. The scene takes place in 1989, at the compound of Don Eladio Fuente, the head of the Juarez cartel. Gus and Max have arranged a meeting with the cartel leadership to pitch a business proposal. They want to produce methamphetamine at a level of purity and consistency that the cartel has never seen, and they want to distribute it through the cartel's existing network. The pitch is ambitious. It requires the cartel to trust two men it does not know, to enter a drug market it is largely ignored in favor of cocaine, and to treat two relative outsiders as partners rather than subordinates. For men as powerful as Don Eladio and Hector Salamanca, this is already an uncomfortable proposition. What makes it worse is how they got there. In order to secure the meeting, Gus and Max had been quietly selling samples of their product to members of the cartel's organization without Eladio's permission. The strategy was to generate enough interest from below that the meeting with the top would become unavoidable. It was a smart play. It was also, from Eladio's perspective, a serious act of disrespect. He had been manipulated into a conversation he had not chosen to have, in front of his own men, by two people who should have known better than to go around him. The meeting begins with a surface civility that the audience can feel is fragile. Eladio compliments the recipe. The conversation is polite, almost formal. Max speaks with enthusiasm about what they have built and what it could become, explaining the chemistry with the excitement of someone who genuinely loves the work. Gus watches, supports, fills in the gaps. For a moment, it is almost possible to believe this will go well. Then Eladio's manner changes. He tells Gus, with the careful precision of a man who wants every word to land, exactly what he thinks of the situation. He points out the disrespect. He makes clear that he does not need to justify himself to anyone. And then, before Gus can fully respond, before the pitch can be redirected or salvaged, Hector Salamanca raises a gun and shoots Max through the head. The shot is fast. The scene does not dwell on the violence in the way that some television would. What it dwells on instead is what happens in the seconds afterward. Gus, who has just watched the person he loves most in the world die in front of him, is forced to the ground. Hector stands over him and makes him look. The camera holds on Gus's face, and what is there is something the show has not shown before and will not show in quite the same way again. The composed, controlled, carefully managed surface that defines him in every other scene is simply gone. What remains is a man in raw, uncontained grief, staring at Max's blood spreading through the water of Eladio's swimming pool. Eladio tells Gus, as he stands over him, that the only reason he is still alive is because of who Gus is and where he came from. The unstated history in Chile provides a protection that Max, who had no such history, did not have access to. Max was useful to the plan. Max was also expendable in a way that Gus, for reasons the cartel understood even if the audience does not, was not. Hector leans down and tells Gus to stick to chicken. The message is unambiguous. The meeting is over. The proposal is rejected. And Gus walks away carrying something that will not heal for the rest of his life. It is worth thinking about what that moment does to a person in the most literal psychological sense. Gus arrived at that meeting as someone with a plan, an ambitious one, built around a partnership that was also a love story. He and Max had come up together, had built something together, had staked a future on the idea that their combined skills, Gus's strategic intelligence and Max's chemical talent, could make them something significant in a world that had not yet decided what to do with them. The restaurant, Los Pollos Hermanos, was named for both of them in the way the name of something is named when it belongs to two people equally. The Chicken Brothers. The business was theirs. The plan was theirs. The future they were angling toward was shared. All of that ended in a single second, in front of Eladio's pool, on a day that Gus had organized and planned and believed was the beginning of something. Instead, it was the end of the version of himself that walked in. The Gus Fring who walked out was already a different person, though the transformation would take years to fully solidify into the form the audience eventually meets. What happened to him psychologically in the aftermath of Max's death is something the shows convey through structure and detail rather than through explicit statement. The grief does not disappear. It goes somewhere else. The Better Call Saul episode titled Dedicado a Max which translates roughly as dedicated to Max, shows Gus arriving at a small villa he has acquired just inside the Mexican border. In the center of the villa's courtyard is a fountain. The fountain is dedicated to Max. Gus has built it there, maintains it, tends to the space around it. This is not a public memorial. No one visits it. It serves no strategic purpose. It exists because Gus needed to put the grief somewhere that he could keep returning to. Somewhere outside himself, where it could sit without threatening the controlled surface that his work and his safety require him to maintain. The detail of the fountain is one of the most quietly devastating things in either show. It reveals that whatever emotional content Gus has walled off from his daily operational life has not been destroyed. It has been housed. He has built it a room of its own, somewhere private, somewhere safe, and he goes there when he needs to. The man who shows nothing in public is, somewhere else, tending a fountain for a person he lost 30 years ago. Giancarlo Esposito has spoken in interviews about the period after Max's death as the moment that explains everything about the Gus that the audience knows. The composure, the discipline, the refusal to let anything through the surface, all of it traces back to that afternoon. The argument is that Gus made a decision, probably not a conscious one in the way decisions are made in a boardroom, but a deep, adaptive decision of the kind the mind makes when it is trying to survive something. That he would never again be in that position. He would never again be the person on the ground, helpless, watching. He would always be the one with the plan, the preparation, the leverage. He would always be the one who knew more than the people in the room thought he knew, who had already thought 3 moves ahead, who could not be caught off guard because he had eliminated the possibility of being caught off guard. The control that defines him is a direct response to the single worst moment of his life, when control was entirely absent. This is a pattern that psychology recognizes, the way traumatic loss can reshape a person's entire relationship to their own vulnerability. When something unbearable happens, particularly something that involved helplessness, one of the common responses is a radical investment in preventing helplessness from ever occurring again. The person builds systems. They plan obsessively. They avoid situations where outcomes cannot be managed. They develop a deep, almost physical aversion to uncertainty, because uncertainty is the condition under which the worst thing happened. In Gus, this response is so total that it has become indistinguishable from his personality. He does not seem like someone who is managing a trauma response. He seems like someone who was simply born this way, who emerged from wherever he came from, already fully formed into this particular shape. The trauma is so thoroughly integrated that it no longer looks like a reaction. It looks like a character. The relationship between Gus and Max is also significant for what it reveals about who Gus was before the loss, and therefore, about what the loss cost him. The flashback shows a younger Gus who is noticeably more open. There is a warmth in his face during the meeting that the older version does not have. He is confident, even a little forward, the kind of person who believes good things are coming and allows that belief to show. The connection between him and Max is visible in the way they move together, finishing each other's points, reading each other's silences. This is not a business relationship that happens to have become personal. It is a personal relationship that has organized a business around itself. Max is the center of Gus's life, and the ambition surrounding them is, at some level, an expression of what Gus wants to build for the two of them. Showrunner Peter Gould confirmed in 2022, around the time Better Call Saul was airing its final season, that Gus and Max were lovers. This had been strongly implied across both shows for years. In Better Call Saul, Lalo Salamanca refers to Max plainly as Gus's boyfriend. In an earlier episode, Hector makes a crude insinuation about the nature of the partnership. Gus's sexuality was always present as a subtext, quietly but consistently. The confirmation made explicit what the writing had been suggesting for the better part of a decade. And once it is explicit, certain things about the character shift slightly in the reading. The loss of Max was not the loss of a business partner or a close friend, though it was both of those things. It was the loss of the person Gus loved, and it happened violently, publicly, in a way that was specifically designed to humiliate. Hector making Gus press his face to the ground and stare at Max while the blood spread through the water. The dehumanization was intentional. Hector wanted Gus to experience the helplessness fully, to feel the hierarchy of the moment in his body, to understand exactly how little power he had. The lesson was delivered with maximum cruelty, and Gus received it completely. What he did with it over the next 20 years was converted. The humiliation became fuel. The grief became architecture. The wound became the engine of everything that followed. He spent 2 decades working inside the cartel structure that had destroyed Max, building his own independent capacity, cultivating relationships, accumulating leverage, constructing the super lab, planning and preparing for a moment of reckoning that he never stopped moving toward. The patience required for that kind of long-term planning is almost incomprehensible unless it is understood as grief work. This is not a man operating on ambition alone. This is a man who found a way to transform his worst pain into the most organized possible response to it. The show makes this explicit in a brief scene in Better Call Saul, where Gus sits at the bedside of Hector Salamanca, who is in a coma following a stroke. The stroke was caused by a medication switch arranged by Nacho Varga, but Gus had ensured that Hector would survive it. He kept Hector alive deliberately, paying for his medical care, ensuring his continued existence. Because Hector dying of a stroke in a hospital bed is not what Gus has been building toward. He tells the unconscious Hector in a low and steady voice a long story about a coati, a small animal he used to watch as a boy near a lucuma tree. The story is calm and almost gentle, and then it turns, and Gus explains, still quietly, that he intends to take everything from Hector before he ends it. He will take his family, his legacy, his organization, and finally, his life. Hector will not die until Gus decides he is ready. And when that moment comes, it will happen on terms that Gus has chosen. This speech is one of the clearest windows the show provides into what has been happening inside Gus for 20 years. The anger is there, and it is enormous. But it is encased in something so structured, so deliberate, so entirely under control, that it barely registers as anger at all. It registers as purpose. The distinction is meaningful. Anger is reactive. It responds to provocation, surges and fades, can be managed or exploited by someone who knows how to provoke it. What Gus has is not anger. It is a fixed bearing, a heading that has not changed since 1989, maintained with such consistency that it has become structural. He does not feel it in the way a person feels emotions that come and go. He inhabits it. It is the ground beneath everything else. The fountain from Max, the speech to the comatose Hector, the 20-year plan, the maintained composure, the radical self-discipline, all of it points back to the same source. One afternoon, one shot, one man pressing another man's face to the ground while blood spread through the water. Everything Gus Fring became after that moment is a response to that moment. And understanding that is understanding the most essential thing about him. The empire was built on grief. The mask was built over loss. The patience was built from something that had nowhere else to go. Don Eladio told Gus he was not in Chile anymore. He was right and wrong at the same time. Gus was not in Chile, but he was still completely inside the moment at the pool, still carrying it, still letting it run him in the deep ways that the worst moments always run the people they happen to. The geography changed. The wound stayed exactly where it was. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The wound gave him his reason. What he built in service of that reason was something else entirely. A structure so sophisticated and so carefully layered that even the people inside it could not see its full shape. Next comes the architecture of the empire itself. Section 4. The architecture of control. Start with the chicken. Not the drugs, not the laundry, not the underground laboratory built to aerospace-level specification beneath an industrial facility in Albuquerque. The chicken. Because the chicken is where everything begins, and understanding how the chicken works is understanding the entire logic of what Gus Fring built and why it lasted as long as it did. Los Pollos Hermanos, which translates from Spanish as the Chicken Brothers, began as a genuine restaurant. Gus and Max opened it in Mexico in the late 1980s as a working business, a place that served food and employed people, and generated revenue through the ordinary mechanics of a fast food operation. The name itself carried meaning. Brothers. The two of them, together, bound by something that went beyond a business arrangement into something more personal, more permanent. When Max died, Gus became the sole owner of a restaurant that had been named for both of them. And he kept the name. He kept running it, expanded it, built it into a chain with locations across New Mexico, Colorado, and Utah. From the outside, this looks like the act of a businessman protecting an asset. From the inside, it looks like something closer to a memorial. The restaurants kept the name alive. They kept the original intention alive. The thing Gus and Max had built together and intended to grow. The empire that followed was constructed around a foundation that had always been partly about grief. By the time the audience meets Gus in Breaking Bad, Los Pollos Hermanos has 14 locations across the American Southwest. It is a legitimate, thriving business. The food is good. The restaurants are clean. The service is consistent. Gus runs the operation with the same exacting standard he brings to everything else, and his employees, the ones working the fryers and wiping the tables and answering the phones, are genuinely well managed. He knows their names. He notices when something is off. He holds the line on quality not as a performance of normality, but because he actually cares about the quality. The legitimate business is not a shell. It is a real enterprise, run by someone who would have been good at running it, regardless of what else it was concealing. What it conceals is extraordinary. The distribution network that Gus has built uses the restaurant chain as its primary logistical spine. Methamphetamine produced in the superlab is weighed, bagged, and transported to Gus's factory farm outside Albuquerque. There, the product is submerged in large tubs of Los Pollos Hermanos batter ingredient, sealed and marked with ultraviolet stamps invisible to the naked eye. The tubs travel on refrigerated trucks through the normal Los Pollos supply chain, delivered to restaurants across the region the way food supplies are delivered to any chain with multiple locations. At certain restaurants, at certain times, the marked tubs are separated from the genuine food product, and the drugs inside them are passed to local dealers and distributors. The whole system is hidden inside the entirely normal operations of a regional fast food company. It moves through the same channels as everything else, looks identical to everything else, and generates records that, on inspection, show a fried chicken business receiving supplies and distributing food, which is exactly what it is, in addition to everything else it is. This is the governing logic of the entire operation: concealment through normalcy. not hidden rooms and coded messages and the kind of conspicuous secrecy that draws attention by its very effort to avoid attention. Instead, a structure so ordinary on its surface that the instinct to look harder at it simply does not arise. The best camouflage is not invisibility. It is belonging. Gus built something that belonged so completely to the visible, legitimate world that the invisible, illegitimate world inside it had nowhere that anyone would naturally think to look. The second major piece of the architecture is Lavanderia Brillante, which translates as bright laundry. This is a large industrial laundry facility in Albuquerque, and on the surface, it is exactly what it presents as: a commercial cleaning operation serving hotels, hospitals, and other institutional clients. Below the surface, literally below it, is the Super Lab, a full-scale methamphetamine production laboratory built to industrial specification, accessed through the laundry's basement, concealed beneath a working business whose own operations provide a plausible explanation for the chemical equipment, the industrial machinery, the ventilation systems, and the electricity consumption that a lab of that scale requires. The laundry generates heat and steam and requires substantial electrical power, and has large tanks and filtration systems. None of these things look unusual in an industrial laundry context. All of them would look extremely unusual if someone noticed them in a building with no other reason to have them. The construction of the Super Lab is one of the most detailed subplots in Better Call Saul, and it reveals something important about how Gus thinks about risk. He does not cut corners. He does not rush. He hires Werner Ziegler, a German engineer of exceptional skill, and brings in a small team of specialists who are kept isolated from the outside world for the duration of the build. The construction takes months. It costs an enormous amount. It is done to a standard that goes well beyond what a drug operation strictly needs. Because Gus is not building something temporary or provisional. He is building something permanent, something he intends to run for years, something that will function at the highest possible level of reliability. Because reliability is the thing his entire system depends on. A super lab that breaks down or underperforms is a super lab that creates problems. And problems, in Gus's world, have a way of compounding into catastrophes. So he builds it right the first time, at full cost, without compromise. Werner Ziegler, who leads the construction, eventually makes a mistake. He leaves the secure compound to spend time with his wife, compromising the secrecy of the entire project. Gus, through Mike, arranges for Werner to be found and killed. The decision is made with the same calm that governs everything else Gus does, but it is not made lightly, and the show does not present it as lightly made. Werner is not a threat. He is a good man who made a bad choice at a bad time. Gus kills him anyway, because the architecture of the operation requires it. Because one weak point, one person who knows too much and is now outside the controlled environment, represents a risk that cannot be managed any other way. This is the price of the system Gus has built. It demands absolute control, and absolute control occasionally demands terrible things. The third major structural element is Madrigal Electromotive GmbH, a German industrial conglomerate that holds an ownership stake in Los Pollos Hermanos. Madrigal is a massive diversified company with interests in logistics, food service, energy, and manufacturing across multiple continents. Its connection to a regional American fast food chain is the kind of corporate relationship that exists unremarkably in the modern economy, where large conglomerates hold partial stakes in smaller operations as part of broader portfolio strategies. Nobody looks twice at it. Nobody has a reason to. Madrigal provides Gus with something that the restaurant chain alone cannot fully supply, which is a corporate structure large enough and complex enough that financial activity can be absorbed and obscured within it at a scale that a regional business could not support. The money laundering that Gus's operation requires happens in part through Madrigal's financial structures, aided by executives within the company who are either directly complicit or willfully blind to what is moving through their accounts. Peter Schuler, the Madrigal executive who shares a history with Gus from their time in Chile, is the primary point of contact between the two organizations. Schuler's relationship with Gus is built on that shared past, on the debt and the bond that formed when they were, as Gus has described it, backed into a wall together and found a way out. After Gus's death, Schuler takes his own life rather than face the investigation that is closing around him. Even at the end, the network of loyalty and obligation that Gus built holds, though it holds in a way that destroys the people inside it. Beyond the three primary structures, Gus also maintains a network of properties and personnel that support the operation without being obviously connected to it. He owns a small villa just inside the Mexican border, which serves as a private medical facility managed by a doctor named Barry Goodman. This villa is where Mike is taken to recover after he is injured, and where Gus can provide medical care for his people without the paper trail that a hospital would create. It is also where the fountain dedicated to Max sits in the courtyard. Even this private, grief-marked space has a practical function folded into it. In Gus's world, nothing is purely one thing. The personnel side of the operation is built with the same discipline as the physical infrastructure. Gus does not work with people he considers unreliable. He has a firm rule against dealing with drug addicts or people whose judgment he assesses as poor. This is not merely a personal preference. It is a structural principle. Unreliable people create unpredictable outcomes, and unpredictable outcomes are the thing the architecture is specifically designed to prevent. Every person inside the operation has been evaluated, assessed, and found to meet a standard. Mike Ehrmantraut serves as the head of security and chief enforcer, a role he fills with the same austere professionalism that makes him and Gus, in their very different ways, such natural partners. Victor, Tyrus, and others occupy specific functional roles. Even Nacho Varga, who is coerced rather than hired, is managed with the precision of someone who has been placed exactly where he is useful and monitored constantly to make sure he stays there. The DEA relationship deserves its own attention because it is one of the most audacious elements of the whole design. Gus does not merely avoid law enforcement. He actively cultivates it. He befriends the special agent in charge of the Albuquerque DEA office, a man named George Merkert, to the point where they have a genuine personal connection. He donates to DEA charitable events. He attends fundraisers. He is photographed at law enforcement gatherings as a respected community supporter. The effect of this is layered. On the most obvious level, it provides social cover. The presence of a genuine friendship with a senior DEA official makes it harder for any investigator to build momentum around Gus as a target. Merkert's personal belief in Gus functions as an institutional obstacle, because nobody inside the agency is going to push aggressively on a lead that their boss considers absurd on its face. But there is a second function that is more operationally specific. By maintaining proximity to law enforcement, Gus creates a channel for information. He hears things. He knows what investigations are active, what directions they are moving in, what cases are being built. When something moves toward him, he finds out earlier than he would if he were simply a man trying to avoid detection from a distance. The friendship is, like the restaurant and the laundry and the corporate structure, a working part of the system. It serves multiple purposes simultaneously. Gus does not build redundancies. He builds multifunctionality. Everything in the architecture does at least two jobs. What makes all of this remarkable, from a narrative and psychological perspective, is that it was built over decades by a single person operating under sustained threat. The cartel, which Gus officially serves as a distributor, does not know the full extent of what he has assembled. Eladio believes Gus is a loyal and profitable partner in a relationship that Eladio controls. What Eladio does not see is that Gus has been building toward independence the entire time, working toward the day when he will no longer need the cartel's cocaine distribution network, because he will have his own meth production and his own distribution infrastructure, capable of operating without them. The Superlab is the Declaration of Independence written in concrete and chemistry equipment. It is the moment when Gus becomes, for the first time since Max died, genuinely free of the people who humiliated him. Sources discussing the show's internal timeline describe the distribution empire at its peak as moving product worth billions of dollars annually across the American Southwest. 16 refrigerator trucks running regularly. A network of local distributors organized through a structure clean enough that none of the individual nodes knows enough about the others to compromise the whole if one of them is arrested. The operation is designed the way a good intelligence service is designed, in cells, with limited lateral knowledge, with clear lines of authority that run upward but do not connect horizontally. Even the people inside it cannot fully see its shape. Gus can. He holds the complete picture in his head, every piece of it, and manages each part with equal attention. The quality of the food in the restaurants, the timing of the truck deliveries, the reliability of the lab equipment, the morale of the people working under him. He notices everything because he built everything to a specification that requires everything to be noticed. The architecture is only as strong as the attention paid to maintaining it, and Gus pays that attention without apparent effort, the way a musician who has practiced long enough pays attention to the music without thinking about the mechanics of playing. Vince Gilligan has described Gus as someone whose intelligence and discipline are expressed not through genius moments, but through sustained, relentless competence. There is no single brilliant move that defines him. There are 20 years of careful moves, each one considered, each one executed cleanly, each one building on the ones before it. The empire is not a monument to inspiration. It is a monument to patience and to the compounding effect of never making unnecessary mistakes. And yet, for all its sophistication, the architecture has a structural weakness that will eventually bring everything down. It is not a flaw in any of the physical systems. It is not a failure of planning or personnel or logistics. It is something older and more personal. Something that was there before the first restaurant opened and the first truck ran. The wound at the center of everything. The grief that went underground and came back as a plan. The revenge that Gus has been building toward for 20 years. Because the architecture was not built purely in service of profit or power. It was built in service of a personal reckoning that required Hector Salamanca to be alive and suffering for as long as possible. And that requirement, the need for Hector specifically, the refusal to let go of the original purpose, is the crack in the foundation of an otherwise perfect structure. Everything else Gus built was rational, disciplined, and clean. The Hector problem was none of those things. And Walter White, who understood obsession because he was consumed by his own, eventually found it. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The architecture was the work. The performance was the man who inhabited it every day, in every room, in front of every person who looked at him and saw nothing but a restaurant owner. Next is how Giancarlo Esposito built that performance, and what it cost him to get it right. Section 5. The performance. Sometime in 2008, Giancarlo Esposito received a script for a television show that was entering its second season and had not yet become the cultural phenomenon it would eventually be. The show was Breaking Bad. The character being offered was a drug lord who ran a fried chicken restaurant, and buried in the stage directions, in the kind of descriptive language that scripts use to orient an actor toward the interior life of a role, was a single phrase that stopped Esposito cold. The character, the directions said, was hiding in plain sight. Esposito has told this story in several interviews and public talks, and the detail that keeps returning is the force of that phrase when he first encountered it. He has described it as a moment of recognition rather than discovery. The feeling of reading something that described not just a fictional character, but something he understood from the inside. He spoke openly about having spent much of his own life concealing parts of himself, presenting a surface to the world that was not entirely false, but was also not entirely complete, managing the gap between who he was in public and who he was in private. The phrase, hiding in plain sight, landed, he has said, because it named something he knew. That personal recognition is worth holding on to, because it goes a long way toward explaining why the performance works as well as it does. Actors who find themselves in a role, who locate within it something that maps onto genuine personal experience, tend to bring a density to the work that is difficult to manufacture from the outside. The character becomes inhabited rather than constructed. The interior life feels real because something real is feeding it. Esposito did not have to build Gus Fring from scratch using technique alone. He had something to connect the character to, something underneath the craft that gave the whole thing its particular weight. Before any of that could happen, though, Esposito nearly did not take the role at all. The initial approach from the Breaking Bad producers was an offer to audition for what was presented as a guest spot, a limited appearance in a show that, at that point in its run, was critically admired but not yet widely watched. Esposito was already a seasoned actor with decades of stage and screen work behind him, including significant roles in films by directors of the caliber of Spike Lee. The idea of auditioning for a guest spot on a show that was still finding its audience did not appeal to him. He refused. The producers came back. They offered to expand the role into something more substantial, a recurring presence rather than a single appearance. Esposito reconsidered. He read the script for the Season 2 episode that would introduce the character, and the stage direction stopped him the way it did. He agreed to move forward, but there was still the matter of money. The salary being offered fell short of what he felt the work warranted. He went back to the network and made his case. The network met him. He has spoken about this moment as a lesson in understanding what one's own work is worth, in the willingness to advocate for that worth, even when the easy path would be to simply accept what was offered and be grateful for the opportunity. The negotiations settled, Esposito began the work of figuring out who Gus Fring actually was. The approach he developed is one of the more unusual preparation methods in recent television acting, in that it was less about research into the criminal world the character inhabits, and more about finding the physiological key to the character's inner life. Esposito turned to yoga and meditation. He practiced both daily throughout the production of Breaking Bad, and has credited them as central to his ability to achieve and maintain the quality of stillness that Gus requires. The point was not simply to be calm on screen. The point was to build a genuine capacity for stillness at a level where it could be accessed under the specific conditions of a working film set, with cameras and crew and the particular pressures of scheduled shooting days, without the stillness becoming rigid or empty. What Esposito was after, and what he describes with some precision in interviews, is a kind of grounded quiet that does not read as absence. Gus Fring is not blank. He is not simply a man from whom emotion has been removed. He is a man in whom emotion is present but contained, managed, held at a specific temperature. The performance has to convey that the interior is full, even when the exterior shows almost nothing. Too much nothing, and the character becomes opaque and uninteresting. Just enough revealed through the smallest possible signals, and the character becomes the thing Gus actually is, which is a person whose depths the audience can sense without being able to fully see. Vince Gilligan has spoken about the audition in terms that are revealing. He has said that before he met Esposito, he had some concern about whether the actor was the right fit, based on earlier work that had shown a more overtly expressive register. Gilligan's instinct was that Gus needed restraint above all other qualities, and he was not immediately sure Esposito could find it. What the audition demonstrated was that the concern was unnecessary. Esposito walked in and inhabited the character's particular quality of controlled, watchful quiet with such completeness that the doubt dissolved. The comparison Gilligan has reached for is Al Pacino in the early Godfather films, a performance in which genuine menace is communicated through economy rather than emphasis, where the still moments are more threatening than the active ones because of what they imply about the depth of the calculation happening behind them. The economy of movement that defines Gus Fring on screen is something Esposito has discussed as a deliberate and disciplined craft choice. Every gesture is considered, every shift of weight, every turn of the head, every moment of eye contact, and every moment of its withdrawal is placed. Nothing is casual. This sounds, described that way, like an exhausting way to perform a role, a constant act of self-monitoring that would drain the spontaneity from the work. What Esposito found, through the yoga and meditation practice, was that the monitoring could become internalized to the point where it no longer felt like monitoring. The stillness became natural, available on demand, something he could access the way a musician accesses muscle memory. The deliberateness stopped feeling deliberate. One of the specific challenges of the role is the relationship between silence and threat. Gus Fring's most frightening moments are almost never the ones where he raises his voice or moves quickly or does anything that registers as overtly aggressive. They are the pauses, the moments where he says nothing and does nothing and simply looks, and the person across from him gradually becomes aware that the absence of a response is itself a response, that the stillness has a quality to it that is worse than anger would be, because at least anger is readable. The stillness is not readable. The stillness could be anything. It could be the moment before forgiveness, or the moment before a decision has been made that the other person will not like. The audience cannot tell, and neither can the character being looked at. And that uncertainty is the mechanism through which the scene generates its dread. Esposito has talked about learning to fill that silence with breath and attention rather than with performed blankness. The yoga practice gave him access to a quality of presence and stillness that communicates interiority without externalizing it. He is not doing nothing in those pauses. He is doing something very specific and very internal, and enough of it reaches the surface through the eyes, through the micro adjustments of posture and focus, that the audience registers a mind working even when the face barely moves. The challenge doubled when Esposito returned to the character for Better Call Saul, where he was asked to play a younger version of Gus. His own description of the adjustment is instructive. He wanted, he has said, a Gus who was more vulnerable, less definitively settled into who he was going to be. A Gus who knew where he was going in general terms, but had not yet fully resolved how to get there. The meticulous, impenetrable quality of the Breaking Bad version of the character had to be softened, not removed, but made slightly more porous, so that the distance between this version and the fully formed one could be felt. This is a delicate calibration. Too much softening and the character becomes inconsistent. Too little and the prequel loses its reason for existing. Because if the younger Gus is identical to the older one, there is no arc to trace. What Esposito found was a way to preserve the essential quality of the character: the intelligence, the watchfulness, the control, while allowing slightly more of the workings to be visible. The younger Gus makes choices that feel considered rather than automatic. He is still operating at a very high level, but the operation occasionally shows. There are moments in Better Call Saul where Gus's calculation is visible in a way it almost never is in Breaking Bad, where the audience can see him working something out in real time, rather than simply delivering a conclusion that has already been reached. This is the difference between a master and an apprentice master, and Esposito manages it without breaking the continuity of the character. The physical discipline extended to the smallest details of how Gus moves through space. Esposito has spoken about the choice of how Gus walks, how he carries his body in different contexts. In the restaurant, in public, there is a particular quality of unhurried ease, the body language of someone who is exactly where they are supposed to be, and who finds nothing surprising or threatening about their environment. In private moments, or in moments of concealed intensity, the carriage shifts subtly, becomes more alert, more economical. These shifts are small enough that most viewers would not identify them consciously, but they register. They contribute to the sense that the person on screen is genuinely inhabiting two different modes of being, rather than performing a single fixed state. The famous death scene in the Season 4 finale of Breaking Bad, in which Gus walks out of an explosion with half his face destroyed and pauses to straighten his tie before collapsing, required 19 separate takes to capture to Vince Gilligan's satisfaction. Gilligan has described the challenge as the need for the sequence to play in one uninterrupted flow, a single camera movement from the explosion to the reveal of Gus's wounds to his collapse, with no cuts to hide behind. Esposito had to hit the specific quality of the moment, the strange composure of a man whose body has not yet fully registered what has happened to it, repeatedly, under the physical demands of the makeup and the prosthetics and the choreography of the shot, until the take existed that felt inevitable. Gilligan has said he used the 19th take. He made a point of saying he was proud of that the best take was the last one, that Esposito's patience and commitment through 18 attempts that were not quite right produced a 19th that was. The result is one of the most replayed moments in the show's history, and its power is almost entirely dependent on the performance. The special effects work is extraordinary. The prosthetics and CGI that created the visual of the destroyed half of Gus's face are genuinely impressive pieces of craft. But what makes the moment land, what gives it the quality that has lodged it so firmly in the cultural memory of television, is what Esposito does in the seconds between walking out of the room and falling to the floor. The straightening of the tie, the last, fading effort of the disciplined self to maintain its presentation even as the body fails. It is a gesture of pure character, and it could only have come from an actor who understood, at the deepest level, what that discipline had cost Gus Fring and what it meant to him to maintain it. The broader trajectory of Esposito's career after Breaking Bad reflects what the performance of Gus Fring made possible. He has spoken about the role as something that opened doors in ways that decades of good work had not fully managed. The Mandalorian, The Boys, and other high-profile projects followed, each of them drawing on the particular quality of controlled, intelligent menace that Gus established. There is a version of those roles that does not exist without the foundation that Breaking Bad built. And that foundation was built on a single creative insight, located in a stage direction about hiding in plain sight, developed through yoga practice and stillness work, and 19 takes on a death scene that had to be perfect, and carried across 2 shows and more than a decade by an actor who found in the character something he recognized from his own life. The character of Gus Fring is named, according to writer George Mastras, after a German footballer named Thorsten Frings. Mastras has described the decision as largely pragmatic, that the name had a quality he liked and the spelling was adjusted slightly to remove a punctuation problem. The origin of the name is almost comically ordinary for a character who has generated such an extraordinary amount of analysis and discussion. A German footballer, a stage direction, a moment of personal recognition, a salary negotiation. 19 takes. This is how an icon gets built. Not from a single grand gesture, but from a series of small, committed choices that compound into something that lasts. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The performance gave Gus his face. The plan gave him his purpose. 20 years of patience, systematic destruction, and a fixed point that never moved. Next is what it actually takes for a person to hold a course that long without breaking. Section 6. The long game. 20 years is a long time to wait for anything. Most plans dissolve long before they reach their destination. Not because the people who make them lose the desire to see them through, but because desire alone is not enough to sustain a course of action across 2 decades of changing circumstances, competing pressures, and the ordinary erosion that time applies to everything. Plans require maintenance. They require the person carrying them to remain oriented toward a fixed point across years of movement, years of distraction, years of smaller urgencies that demand attention and energy and keep pulling the focus toward the immediate and away from the distant. Most people, faced with that kind of sustained demand, eventually adjust the plan, shorten it, compromise it, trade the original vision for something achievable in the near term, and tell themselves it amounts to the same thing. Gus Fring does not adjust. From the afternoon at Don Eladio's pool in 1989 to the afternoon in that same place in 2009 when he watches Eladio drown face first in the water, exactly 20 years pass. The plan does not shorten or shift or compromise. The end point stays fixed, and Gus moves toward it at the pace the situation permits. Faster when opportunity opens, slower when caution demands it, but always moving, always oriented, always closer than he was before. The 20-year plan is one of the most psychologically striking aspects of the character, and understanding how it was sustained requires thinking seriously about what kind of mental structure makes that kind of patience possible. The first thing to understand is that Gus does not experience the 20 years as waiting. Waiting implies a passive state, a person holding still while time passes, and external circumstances eventually align to produce the desired result. What Gus does is almost the opposite of that. Every year of the 20 is active, deliberate, and directed. He is building things. He is establishing relationships. He is positioning himself inside the cartel structure in ways that increase his leverage and reduce his vulnerability. He is acquiring resources and capabilities that will be necessary when the moment comes. The endpoint is fixed, but the path toward it is a continuous series of active choices, each one made with the full attention and discipline that defines everything he does. This distinction matters because it changes the psychological picture. A person who waits for 20 years in a passive sense is someone living in a kind of suspended state, orienting their entire existence around an absence, a thing not yet achieved. That kind of existence tends to become distorted over time, the person shrinking around the gap, unable to invest fully in the present because the future they are waiting for is always pulling the energy forward. Gus does not shrink. He grows. He expands. He builds an empire. He becomes a pillar of the Albuquerque business community. He develops genuine competence across multiple domains and genuine relationships with people who have no idea what is running underneath the surface of his life. The long game is folded into a full life rather than substituting for one. This is what makes it sustainable across 20 years. The revenge is the engine, but it does not consume the vehicle. When Gus walks away from the pool in 1989, he walks into a position of extraordinary vulnerability. He has just watched Max die. He is now formally under Eladio's authority, a distributor who works for the cartel on the cartel's terms, with no meaningful leverage and no ability to refuse what is asked of him. Eladio has made the power structure explicit and humiliating. Gus distributes cocaine for the cartel, takes his cut, and is expected to be grateful for the arrangement. The restaurants continue, the public face continues, and underneath all of it, something is beginning that Eladio cannot see and would not believe if he could. What Gus begins building almost immediately is independence. Not visible independence. Not anything that would register as defiance or ambition from the outside. But the quiet, incremental accumulation of capacity that does not need anyone's permission because no one knows it is happening. He is working toward the day when he will not need the cartel's cocaine network because he will have his own product and his own distribution infrastructure. The Super Lab in Better Call Saul is the culmination of this, but the thinking behind it begins much earlier. Gus has understood from the beginning that the cocaine dependency is a leash. As long as the cartel's product is essential to his business, Eladio owns a piece of him. The plan, the long plan, requires that piece to be removed. The relationship with the cartel across those 20 years is one of the most sustained and complex performances in the show. Gus must appear loyal, profitable, and unthreatening to an organization that is run by people who are themselves expert at reading deception and motivated to find it. Eladio is not naive. Juan Bolsa, the cartel's operational chief and Eladio's right hand, is experienced and careful. Hector Salamanca, who controls the cartel's operations in the American Southwest and who is Gus's most direct point of contact with the organization, is brutal and suspicious by nature. These are not people who are easy to fool, and Gus has to fool all of them, continuously, for 2 decades, while simultaneously using every interaction with the organization to advance his own position. The way he does this is through a quality of service that gives the cartel no reason to look harder. He delivers what he promises. He is reliable, consistent, and profitable. He never causes unnecessary trouble, never makes demands above his station, never gives any indication that he is anything other than what the cartel believes him to be, which is a smart and disciplined distributor who is very good at his job and knows his place in the hierarchy. The performance is so convincing and so sustained that Juan Bolsa, when Lalo Salamanca raises suspicions about Gus in Better Call Saul, actively defends him. Gus enjoys the trust of Don Eladio, Bolsa says, and that trust has been earned over 20 years of reliable service. This is precisely the position Gus has worked to establish. He has made himself, through 2 decades of impeccable performance, into someone whose loyalty is taken as a given rather than a question. Meanwhile, below the surface, he is systematically removing the pillars that hold the cartel structure up. This is done with extraordinary patience and indirection. He does not move directly against the cartel. He moves around it, removing individual pieces in ways that look like accidents or like the natural casualties of an industry where violence is common. The Salamanca cousins, Lionel and Marco, die in an attack that Gus arranged by providing the DEA with information about their plans. Juan Bolsa, who was complicit in the attack on the cousins and contacts Hank Schrader in an attempt to contain the fallout, is killed by Mexican federal police in a sequence that Gus has engineered. Each death is clean in the sense that it does not connect back to Gus directly. Each one weakens the cartel's capacity and its internal trust, while leaving Gus's position within it apparently unchanged. He tells Hector, in a nursing home scene that is one of the most chilling in either show, that he has orchestrated all of this. He names the cousins. He names Bolsa. He tells Hector that what is happening is blood for blood, payment for Max, and that Hector is being saved for last. He says this quietly, without heat, sitting across from a man who cannot speak and can barely move, watching for any flicker of response in the paralyzed face. The cruelty of the delivery, the calm of it, the precision with which he chooses this moment and this audience, reveals something that the surface of the performance usually keeps hidden. There is satisfaction in this. There is something that functions like pleasure in the systematic destruction of the people responsible for what happened at the pool. It is disciplined pleasure, managed and proportioned, but it is there. The long game is not only strategic, it feeds something. The cartel's eventual decision to demand that Gus turn over the formula for the blue meth creates the opening Gus has been positioned to use. Eladio wants the product, and Gus, having spent the previous period maneuvering events so that this demand would come at exactly this time, has already prepared for it. He travels to Mexico with Mike and Jesse, ostensibly to have Jesse cook a batch for the cartel's super lab and train their chemists. The real purpose of the trip is the poison. Gus has arranged for a very specific bottle of tequila to be brought to the gathering of Eladio and his leadership. He toasts with them, drinks from the same bottle, and then excuses himself to the bathroom. The timing is exact. He has prepared a capsule that delays the toxin's absorption long enough for him to purge it and survive, while everyone else in the room begins to die. The plan required knowing which tequila Eladio would reach for, knowing the layout of the compound, knowing the timing of the poison's effects, and having a team already in place to handle the security and facilitate the escape. Every variable has been accounted for. Eladio stumbles toward the pool. He falls in. He drowns in the same water where Max bled to death 20 years before. The symmetry is not coincidental. Gus chose this location and this method with the specific intention that the place of Max's death would become the place of Eladio's. The man who forced Gus to watch dies in the water he forced Gus to stare into. The revenge is not merely functional, it is architectural. It has been built to mirror the original wound as exactly as possible. There is a question that runs beneath all of this, which is what the completion of the plan actually gives Gus. He has been moving toward this endpoint for 20 years. He has organized his entire life, his empire, his relationships, his daily discipline around a fixed point that is now reached. Eladio is dead. Bolsa is dead. The cousins are dead. Hector is alive, suffering, waiting to be used as the instrument of the final piece. The plan is almost entirely fulfilled. What does a person built around a 20-year purpose become when that purpose is achieved? The show gives a subtle and unsettling answer. Gus does not relax. He does not expand into the space that the completed revenge might be expected to open. The infrastructure of his life, the discipline, the control, the two-dimensional existence between the public face and the private mission continues unchanged. There is a moment in Better Call Saul, after Gus has eliminated Lalo Salamanca and removed the last immediate threat to his operation, where he visits a wine bar and has a quiet, genuine conversation with a sommelier named David. The scene has a warmth to it. There is something almost tender in the exchange. Two people who know wine talking about wine. A glimpse of a life Gus could perhaps have lived. And then something shifts in Gus's expression. Some internal calculation completes, and he leaves. The wine bar, the warmth, the glimpse of an ordinary evening. He cuts it short and walks away. The reading that many analysts have offered for this moment is that Gus cannot allow himself to have it. The 20-year project, the discipline it required, the self that was built to sustain it, has become so total that an ordinary evening at a wine bar feels dangerous rather than restorative. The self that does not hide, the self that could sit with David and talk about Burgundy and not be managing anything, is not a self that Gus knows how to inhabit anymore. Whether it was ever available to him, given what Chile may have required and what the pool definitively took, is an open question. But the wine bar scene suggests that the plan, while it provided the purpose that sustained 20 years of extraordinary discipline, has also foreclosed the kind of existence that a completed revenge might theoretically liberate. This is one of the darker psychological observations the show makes about Gus Fring. The revenge was genuine. The love for Max was genuine. The 20 years of patience and discipline and strategic brilliance were in service of something real and deeply felt. But the person who emerged from that process is someone for whom the mission and the self have become indistinguishable. The plan was so thoroughly integrated into his identity that its completion does not free him. It simply leaves him holding a structure that was built for a purpose and is now standing without one. What remains is Hector, the last piece. And Hector is not yet dead, because Gus has decided he is not yet ready. Because the nature of the revenge against Hector is different from the nature of the revenge against Eladio. Eladio ordered Max's death. Hector pulled the trigger and held Gus's face to the ground. The personal dimension of what Hector did demands something more specific than poison at a party. It demands that Hector understand what is happening to him and why. It demands that the humiliation be answered with something that Hector will feel, consciously, as an answer. This is why Gus keeps him alive and keeps visiting him in the nursing home, checking in, watching the paralyzed face for any sign that the message is being received. He is not finished with Hector, because Hector has not suffered enough yet. The plan for Hector is not about killing him. It is about making the dying mean something specific. The long game, in other words, does not end with Eladio. It ends with Hector. And the way it ends, the pipe bomb and the nursing home, and the 20-year enemy finally looking Gus in the eye one last time, is the last chapter of something that began the afternoon a young man was forced to press his face to the ground beside a swimming pool. 20 years of building, 20 years of patience, 20 years of a life organized around a wound that was too deep to heal and too important to forget. The plan worked. Almost entirely. Completely, in fact, except for one variable that no amount of planning could fully account for. A chemistry teacher from Albuquerque, with a terminal cancer diagnosis and nothing left to lose, who turned out to be the one thing in Gus Fring's world that did not behave the way calculated things behave. Walter White was not a Hector Salamanca, or a Don Eladio, or a Juan Bolsa. He was something Gus had no existing category for. And understanding why that mattered requires looking at the two of them together, at the mirror they held up to each other, and at what Gus saw reflected there that he perhaps recognized too late. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The long game required a perfect opponent to sustain it, and in Walter White, Gus found something he had not planned for. Next puts the two of them in the same frame, and looks at what the mirror between them reveals about both. Section 7. The Mirror. There is a moment early in the professional relationship between Gus Fring and Walter White where Walt says something that he clearly believes and that Gus just as clearly does not. Walt tells Gus that the two of them are alike. He says it with the confidence of a man who has identified a genuine symmetry, who believes he has seen something real in the person across from him. Gus's response is immediate and flat. He tells Walt that he does not think they are alike at all. The exchange is brief. It passes quickly and the conversation moves on. But the disagreement sitting inside it is one of the most generative tensions in the entire show, because both men are right and both men are wrong at exactly the same time. And the specific ways in which they are right and wrong about each other illuminate something essential about who each of them actually is. On the surface level, the similarities between Gus Fring and Walter White are easy to catalog. Both men lead double lives, maintaining a public identity that conceals criminal activity of enormous scale. Both are highly intelligent and capable of sophisticated strategic thinking. Both are deeply invested in the quality of their product, approaching the chemistry of methamphetamine with a standard of excellence that goes well beyond what the market strictly requires. Both have constructed their criminal identities around a loss, around something taken from them that they cannot get back and cannot stop responding to. Both are, in their very different ways, men whose sense of themselves depends on the belief that they are exceptional, that the ordinary rules and ordinary categories do not fully apply to them, that what they have built is the expression of something rare. Walt, in identifying these overlaps, concludes that Gus must understand him in a way that other people do not, must recognize in him a kind of peer, a fellow traveler in the particular territory of the brilliant man operating outside the constraints that hold lesser people in place. This is a significant misreading. The similarities are real, but they are organized around entirely different centers of gravity. And those different centers produce characters who are, in the ways that matter most, almost precisely opposite. The writer George Mastras, who created the name Gustavo Fring, was working on a show that had already established a philosophical framework for thinking about the chemistry of identity. In the very first episode of Breaking Bad, Walt teaches his students about chirality, the property of certain molecules that exist as mirror images of each other. Two chiral molecules are composed of exactly the same elements in exactly the same proportions, and are arranged in structures that look identical when placed side by side. But they are not identical. They are mirror images, which means they are fundamentally, irreducibly different at the level of their spatial organization. They cannot be superimposed on each other. The same ingredients, the same structure, opposite orientations. And in chemistry, that difference in orientation can produce completely different behaviors. A molecule and its mirror image can interact with the world in ways that are nothing alike, despite being made of exactly the same things. The show does not announce that this concept applies to Gus and Walt. It does not need to. The parallel is structural. These are two men made of recognizably similar elements, organized around incompatible orientations, producing effects in the world that are radically unlike each other, despite the surface resemblance that Walt keeps reaching for, and Gus keeps refusing to validate. The most fundamental difference is the relationship each man has with control. Both value it. Both have built systems designed to maintain it. But for Walt, control is always instrumental, always in service of something else, always a means toward an end that is ultimately about recognition. Walt wants to be seen. He wants the world to acknowledge what he is capable of. The famous moment in the final season where he tells his wife that everything he did for himself, that he liked it and was good at it, and it made him feel alive, is the most honest thing Walter White says in the entire run of the show. The criminal enterprise was never primarily about money or security or even survival. It was about the experience of being someone who matters, someone whose abilities cannot be ignored, someone who cannot be reduced to a dying chemistry teacher in a depressing classroom. Control, for Walt, is the feeling he was denied before Heisenberg, and cannot stop reaching for once he has found it. For Gus, control is structural rather than experiential. He does not pursue it because it makes him feel a particular way. He pursues it because the absence of it produced the worst moment of his life, and the architecture of control he has spent decades building is a direct response to that specific vulnerability. Control is not about recognition for Gus. He actively avoids recognition. He drives an aging Volvo and manages a fast food restaurant floor, and makes sure that nobody, ever, looks at him and sees something worth examining more closely. The feelings that Walt cannot stop advertising are the feelings that Gus cannot afford to show. The difference in orientation could not be more complete. This difference extends to the way each man handles the people who work under him. Gus is demanding and unsparing in his standards, but his relationship to the people inside his organization has a quality of professionalism that carries genuine respect. He evaluates people carefully, gives them clear roles, pays them well, and treats competence as something to be cultivated and rewarded. When Mike tells Gus that Werner Ziegler has left the secure compound, Gus's decision to have Werner killed is made with evident reluctance. The reluctance of someone who valued Werner's skills and is now destroying them because the system requires it. The system comes first, always, but the loss is acknowledged. Walt's relationship to the people around him moves in the opposite direction over time. He begins with some capacity for genuine connection, and ends by using everyone he has ever cared about as a resource, treating their well-being as relevant only insofar as it serves his own continued operation. The people around Walt are gradually consumed by his needs. The people around Gus are managed, sometimes ruthlessly, but within a framework of professional obligation that Gus takes seriously. Jesse Pinkman sits at the center of this difference in a way that the show develops carefully. Both Gus and Walt have relationships with Jesse that are complicated and instrumental. Both want something from him, but the texture of how they relate to him is telling. Walt's relationship with Jesse is one of the most psychologically tangled in the show, oscillating between genuine paternal feeling and deliberate manipulation, between moments of real connection and calculated exploitation. Walt uses Jesse's emotional vulnerability, his capacity for guilt and loyalty and love, as leverage when it serves him. He poisons a child to manipulate Jesse's perception of Gus. He makes Jesse dependent on him and then manages that dependence strategically. The love is real, and the exploitation is real, and they coexist in a way that is one of the show's most disturbing portraits of a certain kind of relationship. Gus's relationship with Jesse is cooler, more detached, but in certain ways more honest. He identifies Jesse's skills and his emotional needs and works with both. He gives Jesse a sense of purpose and competence at a time when Walt has reduced Jesse to a subordinate role. He treats Jesse as someone capable of operating at a high level and creates the conditions where that capability can develop. The motivation is not warmth. Gus wants a reliable cook who is not Walt, wants to be able to replace Walt when the time comes, and Jesse is the path to that. But the way Gus goes about it, giving Jesse genuine responsibility and genuine acknowledgement, produces something that looks more like respect than anything Walt offers by this point in the story. What Gus cannot do, and what ultimately determines the outcome of the conflict between them, is account for the irrational dimension of Walt's character. This is where the mirror breaks down entirely. Gus is a man whose entire operational logic rests on rationality. Every decision he makes passes through a cost-benefit analysis of extraordinary sophistication. He is not calculating in the crude sense of someone who only thinks about immediate advantage. He is calculating in the deeper sense of someone who can hold many variables across long time horizons and identify the course of action that best serves the complex of interests he is managing. This capacity for rational analysis is the foundation of his 20-year plan, his empire, his survival inside the cartel structure for 2 decades. It is what he is. Walter White, beneath the intelligence and the chemistry and the strategic thinking, is fundamentally irrational. He is driven by pride and ego and a need for recognition that overrides his judgment at critical moments. He makes decisions that no rational analysis would support, because the emotional stakes for him override the operational calculus. He kills 2 drug dealers to protect Jesse at a point when the rational move would have been to let events take their course. He continues cooking and expanding his operation long past the point where he has made enough money to satisfy any practical goal, because stopping would mean admitting that Heisenberg is over. And Heisenberg has become the thing Walt cannot live without. He turns down a buyout that would have given him financial security and ended the risk entirely, because accepting it would mean someone else owns what he built. Gus reads these behaviors and identifies them as liabilities. Walt's unpredictability is a problem that Gus keeps trying to solve through management and containment. He separates Walt from Jesse. He brings Gail Bedecker in as a potential replacement cook, working toward the moment when Walt will no longer be necessary and can be removed. He manages Walt the way he manages other threats, methodically, patiently, reducing the exposure until an opportunity to resolve it cleanly presents itself. What he cannot fully account for is that Walt's irrationality is also his most dangerous weapon. A rational opponent, faced with Gus's level of preparation and resources and patience, tends to find the rational response, which is usually some version of backing down or finding an accommodation. Walt does not back down. He escalates. He does things that no rational analysis would produce, not because he is stupid, but because the emotional engine driving him does not respond to the same inputs that a rational analysis uses. When Gus decides to have Walt killed and the plan fails, when Walt survives and then strikes back, the sequence of events that follows is not one that Gus's framework can fully model. Because the framework assumes that people, when facing overwhelming disadvantage, will respond to incentives and disincentives in predictable ways. Walt responds to them in the ways that serve his ego, which is a different thing entirely. The ricin, the bomb, the use of Hector Salamanca. These are moves that emerge from Walt's particular combination of intelligence and irrationality. His ability to think cleverly in the service of ends that are driven by pride rather than strategy. He does not blow up Gus Fring because it is the strategically optimal move in some larger plan. He does it because Gus is the obstacle between Walt and the version of himself he cannot stop needing to be. The personal stakes for Walt are always, at bottom, about identity. And Gus has become the thing standing between Walt and the full expression of Heisenberg. That makes Gus not just a threat to be managed, but an affront to be eliminated. And the energy that comes from that personal dimension is a kind that Gus's operational logic does not have a category for. There is another dimension to the mirror that the show develops more quietly, which is the relationship each man has with legacy. Gus has built something real and substantial, an empire of considerable sophistication that will outlast any individual piece of it. But the construction has been in service of a purpose that is fundamentally personal and ultimately backward-looking. The long game is oriented toward the past, toward Max, toward the pool, toward an afternoon in 1989 that has been the fixed point of everything since. The Empire is instrumental to the revenge, and the revenge is about restoring something that was taken. Gus is building toward an ending, a completion, a settling of accounts. What comes after that completion is not fully imagined, because the imagination has been so thoroughly directed at the endpoint that the space beyond it has not been filled. Walt claims to be building a legacy, something that will survive him and prove that he was real, that his existence meant something beyond the small life he was living before the cancer diagnosis. But the legacy Walt imagines is also personal, and also, at its root, about recognition. He wants to be known. He wants the name Heisenberg to mean something. He wants the people who underestimated him to understand what they missed. The forward-looking quality of Walt's ambition is real, but it is organized around the same psychological center as Gus's backward-looking one: the need to be seen and acknowledged as exceptional, as someone whose existence changed the shape of things. Both men ultimately destroy themselves in service of these needs. Gus dies because his need for a specific kind of revenge against Hector, the need to use Hector as a weapon rather than simply eliminating him, creates the opening that Walt exploits. If Gus had killed Hector at any point in the years before the finale, if he had treated Hector as a simple operational problem rather than a piece of a deeply personal drama, there is no obvious path by which Walt wins. The bomb in the nursing home only works because Hector is still alive, still accessible, still useful as an instrument. Hector is still alive because Gus needs him to be, needs the ending to look a specific way that mirrors the beginning. The 20-year plan, for all its rationality, has an irrational core. And it is the irrational core that Walt finds. Walt's destruction follows from the same source: the inability to stop, the need for Heisenberg to keep being real, the rejection of every exit that would have saved him. Both men are brought down by the very thing that made them compelling, by the deep personal need that organized everything, and that could not, finally, be managed or contained or subordinated to a rational calculus that would have served their survival. They are not alike. Gus was right about that. But they are made of similar things, organized in opposite ways. And the collision between them is what the show needed to make the fourth season the thing it is. Two chiral molecules, identical in composition, mirrored in structure, producing entirely different reactions when they meet. Neither one capable of occupying the same space as the other. The chemistry teacher was right about one thing, at least. Whatever those two men were to each other, they were something that needed a scientific metaphor to begin to describe. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The mirror between Gus and Walt explains the conflict at the heart of Breaking Bad's fourth season. But Gus was never entirely alone in the frame. Behind him, steady and watchful, was Mike Ehrmantraut. Next looks at that partnership, what it reveals about Gus, and why two such different men stayed in the same orbit for as long as they did. Section 8. The Enforcer. The first real conversation between Gus Fring and Mike Ehrmantraut happens across a significant power imbalance, and both men know it. Mike has been surveilling Hector Salamanca with the intention of eventually killing him, a personal vendetta that Gus has been monitoring through a tracking device planted on Mike's car without his knowledge. When Gus decides the time has come to make contact, he does it by leaving a phone in the middle of a road that Mike is driving down. Mike stops. He picks it up. Gus is on the other end, calm and precise, requesting a conversation and asking that no guns be drawn. The request is polite. The power behind it is not. Gus has demonstrated, through the sequence of events leading to this phone call, that he knows exactly who Mike is, where he goes, what he is planning, and why. He has shown Mike his own surveillance operation from the inside, making clear that every move Mike thought he was making in private was being observed. The note left on Mike's windshield, reading simply, "Don't," is not a threat in the conventional sense. It is a demonstration of capability. A quiet announcement that the person leaving it knows enough and has enough reach to make things very difficult for Mike if that becomes necessary. Mike takes the meeting. He is not the kind of man who responds to demonstrations of capability with wounded pride or performative defiance. He is the kind of man who assesses situations accurately and responds to what is actually in front of him. What is in front of him is someone more organized, more informed, and more patient than anyone he has encountered in the particular world he has recently begun operating in. He takes note of this. He does not like it especially, but he takes note. This first meeting establishes the dynamic that will define the relationship across both shows. Gus holds the structural advantage at every stage, and Mike works within that structure rather than against it. But the relationship is not simply one of employer and employee in any conventional sense, because both men carry a quality of self-possession that prevents genuine subordination. Mike does not become Gus's man in the way that Victor or Tyrus are Gus's men, operatives whose identities are fully subsumed into the organization. He remains, throughout, recognizably himself, with his own code and his own limits, and his own sense of what he will and will not do. Gus accommodates this to a degree that he accommodates nothing else, and that accommodation is itself revealing. What Gus sees in Mike is something genuinely rare in the world he operates in, which is a man whose reliability does not depend on fear or financial incentive alone. Most of the people Gus employs are kept in line through a combination of money and the understanding that the consequences of disloyalty are severe. This is effective up to a point, but it has a ceiling. People managed through fear and money remain reliable only as long as the fear is credible and the money keeps coming. They perform loyalty rather than possessing it, and performance, under sufficient pressure, breaks. Mike's reliability comes from somewhere else. It comes from his own internal standard, the code he carries that determines what he will do and what he will refuse. And that standard is consistent in a way that external incentives cannot manufacture. Gus, who has built an entire empire on the principle that consistency and discipline are the only real foundations of anything durable, recognizes this quality immediately. A man whose reliability is internal rather than external is a different kind of asset from every other person in the organization. He can be given genuine responsibility, trusted with information and access that a performance-based operator could not be trusted with. Deployed in situations where improvisation and judgment are required rather than just execution. Mike is the person Gus can send somewhere difficult without a complete script and trust that the outcome will be managed intelligently. This is not a small thing. In an operation of the complexity that Gus runs, having one person with genuine judgment rather than managed compliance is worth more than a large number of people who follow instructions well. Jonathan Banks, who plays Mike, has spoken about the relationship from his character's perspective, in ways that illuminate its texture from the other side. His consistent position is that Mike and Gus are never close in any personal sense. There is no warmth between them. There is no friendship, no social ease, no dimension of the relationship that exists outside the operational. What there is, Banks has said, is a mutual recognition of competence and a shared pragmatism about the nature of the work. Mike looks at Gus and sees a formidable man, an extremely dangerous man, someone who is very good at what he does and who could, without apparent emotion, decide to end Mike's life if the calculation ever required it. Mike respects this. He does not romanticize it or mistake it for something more personal. He simply works within it because the work is what Mike has, and the pay is what his granddaughter needs. And Gus Fring is the most professionally organized employer available in the particular world Mike inhabits. The absence of closeness is itself meaningful. Most relationships in the Breaking Bad universe that involve Gus produce a kind of dependency in the other person, a psychological pull toward him that makes them vulnerable to his management. Walt becomes obsessed with Gus in ways that go far beyond the professional. Jesse develops something like admiration. Nacho Varga, coerced into service as an informant inside the Salamanca organization, operates in a state of constant fear that Gus either ignores or actively maintains because it keeps Nacho useful. Even Gail Bedecker, who has no reason to be afraid of Gus and experiences him primarily as a generous mentor figure, develops a quality of devotion that makes him easy to manage. Mike does not become devoted or obsessed or afraid. He becomes employed. The distinction protects him in certain ways and limits him in others. Because Mike maintains his own internal standard and does not subordinate it entirely to Gus's purposes, there are things he will not do that Gus needs done. The coercion of Nacho Varga through threats to Nacho's father is a source of genuine friction between them. Mike objects to it. He tells Gus his concern directly, without softening the disagreement or framing it in terms that would make it easier for Gus to absorb. Gus overrules him. The tension does not dissolve. It persists as a low-level current through their working relationship in Better Call Saul. A point of divergence that neither man resolves, that they simply move around because the work requires them to continue, and they are both professional enough to continue. This capacity for Mike to disagree and for Gus to override without the relationship breaking is one of its more unusual qualities. Gus does not generally tolerate people who push back against his decisions. His response to dissent inside the organization is typically to remove the source of it, either by finding another approach or by finding another person. With Mike, the dissent is tolerated, absorbed, and worked around. This is not patience in the sense of Gus waiting for Mike to come around. It is an acknowledgement, never stated but structurally present, that losing Mike over a disagreement would cost more than the friction of accommodating him. Gus makes this calculation, and it shapes how he manages the relationship throughout. The moment that most clearly illustrates what Gus's regard for Mike actually looks like, from the inside, is the period after Werner Ziegler's death in Better Call Saul. Mike is devastated by what he has had to do. Having built a genuine human relationship with Werner over the months of the construction project, and then having been the one to end Werner's life when Gus's operational needs required it. He disappears into a period of drinking and drift that eventually results in him being injured by a local gang. Gus has him taken to the villa near the Mexican border, the private space with the fountain for Max, and has his doctor tend to Mike's injuries. He visits Mike there. He sits with him and asks him to join the organization properly, to become a full member rather than a peripheral contractor. What Gus says to Mike during this conversation is one of the more direct statements he makes anywhere in either show about his own interior life. He tells Mike that he wants him with him because Mike understands what it is to need revenge. He frames the invitation in terms of a shared psychological state, a recognition that both of them are operating from a wound, that both of them have organized significant portions of their lives around losses that cannot be recovered and can only be responded to. Mike's son was killed by corrupt police officers. Gus's partner was killed by the cartel. The losses are different in scale and circumstance, but structurally similar. And Gus appears to believe that this similarity creates a basis for a kind of understanding that he does not find in other people. This is a rare moment of self-disclosure from Gus. He almost never speaks about his own motivations in terms that acknowledge their emotional roots. The composure that defines him in every other context is built partly on keeping the emotional foundation invisible, on presenting the decisions and the plans as the products of rational calculation, rather than as expressions of grief and rage that have been disciplined into strategic form. Here, briefly, he names what is underneath. He tells Mike, in effect, that he is running this operation partly because the operation is pointed toward a reckoning, and he wants the person beside him to understand that, rather than simply performing their role within a structure whose purpose they do not fully see. Mike joins. The relationship deepens without becoming personal. He becomes the head of security and chief enforcer, the person closest to Gus in operational terms, without ever being close to him in human terms. The professional intimacy is real. Mike knows more about how the organization functions, where its vulnerabilities are, what decisions have been made and why, than anyone else inside it. The personal distance is equally real. They remain throughout, two men who respect each other's competence and work together with unusual effectiveness, and have almost nothing to say to each other that is not about the work. The contrast with how Gus relates to other people inside the organization is instructive. With Victor, who serves as one of his primary enforcers, the relationship is straightforwardly hierarchical. Victor executes instructions with efficiency and without apparent interiority. He is useful and valued, but there is no acknowledgement of him as a person whose perspective or limits matter. When Victor's unauthorized action at the Superlab, a display of initiative in a moment where restraint would have served better, creates a liability, Gus kills him, in a manner that serves a dual purpose. It removes the liability and sends a message to Walt and Jesse about what the consequences of unauthorized action look like. Victor's death is efficient and, from Gus's perspective, entirely clean. It does not register as loss. It registers as a management decision. The difference in how Gus treats Victor versus how he treats Mike is not about fondness. It is about assessed value and genuine recognition of a particular quality that Mike has and Victor does not. Victor is a tool. Mike is a collaborator. The distinction matters to Gus in operational terms, and the respect that flows from that distinction is real, even if it is never warm. There is something worth examining in the fact that the person Gus chooses as his closest operational partner is someone defined by loss, and by a personal code built in response to that loss. Mike lost his son, and reorganized his remaining life around providing for his son's family, around honoring an obligation he feels to the people his son left behind. The organization of a life around loss and obligation is something Gus understands from the inside. The 20-year plan for Max is not structurally so different from Mike's commitment to Kaylee's future. Both are men who have converted grief into purpose, who have found a form of forward movement in the maintenance of an obligation to someone they could not save. This is the kind of understanding that Gus was reaching for when he told Mike that Mike understood what it meant to need revenge. It is perhaps the closest thing to genuine recognition that Gus allows himself in either show. What the relationship with Mike reveals about Gus is that behind the operational precision and the managed surfaces, there is a person who is capable of something like identification, who can look at another human being and see not just a resource, but a reflection of a condition he knows personally. The fountain for Max, the speech to Hector in the nursing home, the invitation to Mike at the villa. These are the points in both shows where the thing underneath the architecture becomes briefly visible. They do not soften the character or reduce the damage he causes, but they locate his humanity, narrow and guarded, and organized almost entirely around loss as it is, in a place that the performance can occasionally reach. The relationship with Mike also carries a shadow that both shows acknowledge without fully dramatizing, which is the knowledge that it will end badly. Mike dies in Breaking Bad, killed by Walt in a moment of impulsive rage that serves no operational purpose, and that Walt himself seems barely able to account for. Gus does not live to see it. He is already gone by then. But the world he built, the organization that gave Mike his final years of purposeful work, the structure that held two men who understood each other without being close, dissolves when Gus goes. Mike survives the Empire by one season and then follows it. Two men oriented around loss, working together toward an ending, and reaching their own separate endings in a universe that does not offer the kind of resolution either of them were perhaps somewhere very private, hoping for. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The partnership with Mike kept the Empire running. What ended it was not a failure of the system, but a failure of the plan's own logic. A crack that had always been there, and that one particular man was exactly the right shape to find. Next is the collapse, the death, and 19 takes on the most iconic exit in television. Section 9. The collapse. Every system has a load-bearing flaw. The flaw is not always visible during construction, and the builders do not always know it is there. Sometimes it is discovered only when something hits the structure at exactly the right angle, with exactly the right kind of force, in exactly the place where the design could not fully account for what it was holding. The system stands for years, decades sometimes, against every kind of pressure it was built to resist. And then the thing it was not built to resist arrives, and the flaw becomes visible all at once, and the whole structure comes down faster than anyone watching thought possible. Gus Fring built one of the most sophisticated criminal enterprises in the history of either show. The physical infrastructure was extraordinary. The personnel were carefully selected and managed. The financial structures were layered and obscure. The public persona was so thoroughly constructed that the head of the local DEA office considered Gus a personal friend and a community asset. By any reasonable measure, what Gus built should have been effectively impregnable to any single adversary operating with the resources Walt had available. The flaw was Hector Salamanca. Not Hector as a threat, because by the time the fourth season of Breaking Bad reaches its climax, Hector is paralyzed, voiceless, confined to a nursing home, and represents no conventional operational danger to anyone. The flaw was Gus's relationship to Hector, the specific nature of what Gus needed from him and why, and the way that need created the one opening in the entire architecture that could not be closed without surrendering the thing Gus had built the architecture to achieve. Gus needs Hector to suffer consciously. This is the core of it. The revenge against Eladio and Bosa and the cousins could be executed with the clean efficiency that Gus applies to everything else. Deaths arranged at a distance, through mechanisms that carry no personal signature. But Hector is different. Hector held Gus's face to the ground. Hector made him watch. The revenge against Hector has always been personal in a way the revenge against Eladio was not quite. It requires presence. It requires that Hector know what is happening to him and understand, on some level, the source of it. This is why Gus keeps Hector alive when a stroke should have been allowed to finish the job. This is why Gus pays for Hector's medical care, visits him in the nursing home, and tells him in a quiet and steady voice exactly what has been taken from him and what is still coming. The visits are not intelligence gathering. They are the one place in Gus Fring's entire life where the personal need overrides the professional discipline. where the grief that has been converted into architecture breaks through and demands its original form. Walt finds this. He finds it the way he finds most things, through a combination of desperate circumstances and an instinct for the pressure points in other people that his own enormous ego has, ironically, made him very good at locating. Walt understands pride, because pride is the engine of everything he does. When he looks at Gus's relationship to Hector and reads it accurately as the one place where Gus's rationality gives way to something older and more personal, he is reading his own nature, reflected in the person trying to kill him. The plan Walt constructs is, in certain ways, the most impressive thing he does in the entire series. Not because it is technically sophisticated, but because it requires him to correctly model the psychology of a man who has given almost nothing away. Walt has to believe that Hector's hatred of Gus is strong enough to override self-preservation. He has to believe that Gus's compulsion to personally confront Hector will bring him to a location where he is physically vulnerable. And he has to believe the bomb will function. Every one of these things turns out to be correct. Hector agrees without apparent hesitation. The hatred is that deep. And Gus, when informed that Hector has asked to speak with DEA agents, walks into Casa Tranquila himself. He sends Tyrus first to sweep the room. Tyrus finds nothing. The bomb is attached to the underside of Hector's wheelchair, and Tyrus does not find it because no one anticipated that Hector would be the one carrying the weapon. Gus comes in and stands across from Hector, and something shifts. Hector, who has refused to look at Gus across years of visits, who has kept his gaze averted as the one remaining act of defiance available to him, finally turns his eyes toward Gus and holds them there. The look is not defeat. It is something closer to its opposite. Gus reads it. He reads it in the way that someone who has spent 20 years studying a specific face reads a change in it. Something is wrong. The operational mind, which is never fully surrendered to the personal one, fires an alert. Gus turns and begins to walk toward the door. He does not make it. The explosion takes out the room. What emerges from it, after a moment of stillness, is Gus Fring. Walking, moving with an almost mechanical composure through the corridor of the nursing home, straightening his tie, his face turned away from the camera. Then the camera swings around and the full damage becomes visible. Half his face is destroyed. The left side is gone, the bone exposed, the eye socket empty. What remains of the right side is composed, the jaw set, the posture upright. He takes another step, and then he falls. The production of this sequence required months of preparation. Greg Nicotero and Howard Berger from the special effects company KNBEFX Group, who were simultaneously working on The Walking Dead for AMC, were brought in by Vince Gilligan to design and execute the prosthetic work. They took a mold of Giancarlo Esposito's face and built a maquette, a detailed sculptural model, to determine with precision what the damage from an explosion at that range and angle would actually look like. Gilligan's specific instruction was that he wanted the wound to show depth, to reveal the interior of the head rather than simply adding surface damage. He wanted the audience to understand, viscerally, that what they were seeing was not survivable. The makeup and prosthetics were applied to Esposito's face for the shoot, then combined in post-production with computer-generated imagery that extended and refined the damage beyond what the practical effects alone could achieve. Visual effects supervisor William Pawlowski of Velocity FX has described the process of combining the two elements, practical and digital, as a collaboration that required each department to understand exactly where its contribution ended and the others began. The leading edge of the prosthetic flowed into the digital extension in a way designed to be invisible, so that the whole reads as a single, continuous image rather than a composite. Secondary details were added in post, including an optic nerve visible in the empty socket, still attempting to move an eye that is no longer there. Vince Gilligan has described filming the scene itself as one of the most technically demanding days of his career as a director. The shot was designed to play as a single, uninterrupted sequence, a oneer, moving from the explosion through Gus's emergence from the room and around to the reveal of his face, with no cuts to hide behind. This required Esposito to hit a very specific quality of movement and composure, the mechanical self-possession of a man whose nervous system has not yet processed what has happened to it. Across multiple attempts, on a day where the physical demands of the makeup and the choreography of the shot added pressure to what was already an extraordinarily delicate performance requirement. It took 19 takes. Gilligan has been direct about his own embarrassment at needing that many, describing the day as tense and the pressure as significant. He has also been direct about the outcome, saying he used the 19th take and was proud of that the best take came last, that Esposito's patience and commitment through 18 attempts that were not yet right produced a 19th that was exactly what the scene required. The choice to use the last take rather than an earlier one that might have been close enough is consistent with the standard Gus Fring himself applied to everything he built. Close enough was never sufficient. The thing had to be right. The moment has become one of the most replayed and referenced images in the history of prestige television. The straightening of the tie, the last reflex of the disciplined self, the body performing its habitual maintenance of presentation, even as it fails. It captures something essential about who Gus Fring was and what the discipline cost him. The way the mask held, even in the seconds after a bomb had taken half his face. The way the performance continued past the point where performance could possibly serve any purpose. The episode's title, Face Off, works in two directions at once. It names the confrontation between Walt and Gus that the season has been building toward. It also names what happens to Gus's face in the final minutes. The literal removal of the surface that had concealed everything underneath for 20 years. The Batman villain Two-Face, whose origin involves exactly half a face being destroyed, leaving a man divided between a public self and a hidden one, has been noted by more than one analyst as a visual reference the show appears to be making deliberately. Whether intentional or not, the parallel lands. Gus Fring spent his entire adult life as a man of two faces. The explosion revealed them simultaneously, the public and the private in the same image. The composed restaurant owner and the 20-year revenge plan occupying the same destroyed frame for the few seconds between the corridor and the floor. He falls. The composure releases. The discipline that built an empire and sustained a plan across 2 decades and survived a bomb exhausts itself at last, and Gustavo Fring goes down. Tyrus is dead. The nursing home's security footage will eventually lead investigators back to the operation. Peter Schuler, back at Madrigal, watches the Los Pollos Hermanos logo being removed from the company's brand portfolio and takes his own life rather than face what is coming. The superlab is found. The empire, without its architect, has no structural principle left to hold it together. And it collapses the way things collapse when the person who understood every part of it simultaneously is gone. Walt inherits the vacuum. The territory Gus spent 20 years building becomes the territory Walt spends one more season destroying, including himself. The wound that started everything, the afternoon at the pool in 1989, turned out to be both the foundation of the empire and the crack that ran through it from the beginning. Gus built the most sophisticated criminal structure in the show's universe around a grief that could not finally be subordinated to the structure's own requirements. The architecture was extraordinary. The flaw was human. And in the end, as it tends to, the human part won. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The fall of Gus Fring ended one story and began the conversation that has continued ever since, about what he meant, what he represented, and why a character who appears in a television show for 2.5 seasons has become one of the most analyzed and enduring figures in the medium's history. That conversation lands next. Section 10. The Legacy. When television historians and critics sit down to make lists of the greatest villains the medium has ever produced, Gus Fring appears on almost all of them. TV Guide placed him third on their 2013 ranking of the 60 nastiest villains in television history. Rolling Stone put him 7th on their list of the 40 greatest TV villains of all time in 2016. Paste ranked him 3rd among the best characters of 2011, the year his story ended in Breaking Bad. Collider, in a more recent ranking of the greatest television villains ever made, placed him at the top. These lists disagree on the precise position, but converge on the essential point, which is that Gustavo Fring belongs in the conversation about the finest antagonists the medium has produced, and that the conversation tends to end with his name near the front. What is worth thinking about is why. Television has given audiences memorable villains across decades of serious dramatic writing. The question of what specifically Gus Fring does that others do not is a genuine one. And the answer points towards something important about what this particular character represents in the history of how television tells stories about dangerous people. The conventional television villain, across most of the medium's history, has operated through a fairly stable set of conventions. Villainy was announced, signaled, made legible to the audience through visual and behavioral codes that allowed viewers to orient themselves quickly. The dark clothing, the sharp manner, the moments of cruelty that established moral parameters, the capacity for violence that distinguished the antagonist from the protagonist. All of these conventions served a narrative function. They told the audience who to fear and why, and they maintained a comfortable clarity about where the moral lines of the story fell. Gus Fring does not operate within these conventions. He wears pressed shirts in neutral colors. He smiles at customers. He drives an aging Volvo that says nothing about power or ambition. He donates to law enforcement charities. The visual and behavioral grammar of villainy is entirely absent, replaced by the visual and behavioral grammar of a particular kind of decent, hardworking, community-minded person that the world tends to trust on sight. The absence of the conventional signal is not simply a clever twist on the formula. It is an argument about where danger actually lives, about the ways in which the most serious threats arrange themselves to look like the least threatening things in the room. This argument has a particular resonance in the context of the era in which Breaking Bad aired. The show ran from 2008 to 2013, years defined in American cultural consciousness by the aftermath of a financial crisis in which enormous harm was done to ordinary people by organizations and individuals whose public presentation was entirely respectable, who sat on boards and attended charitable events, and were photographed at law enforcement fundraisers, and who were running operations underneath that presentation that the regulatory and legal structures around them could not see clearly enough to stop. Gus Fring is not a commentary on this in any narrow or polemical sense, but the character's particular form of danger, the empire hidden inside the legitimate business, the criminal enterprise powered by the DEA's own trust, carries a cultural logic that the moment made legible in ways it might not have been in a different decade. The critical recognition that followed the character through both shows extended to the performance as well. Giancarlo Esposito received 3 nominations for the Primetime Emmy Award for Outstanding Supporting Actor in a Drama Series across his time on Breaking Bad and Better Call Saul. He won the Critics' Choice Television Award for Best Supporting Actor in a Drama Series at the third Critics' Choice ceremony, and won it again in 2023 for his work on Better Call Saul. The Los Pollos Hermanos Employee Training Series, a 10-part promotional web series released in 2017 to coincide with the third season of Better Call Saul, featuring Esposito as Gus, delivering workplace instruction videos entirely in character, won the Primetime Emmy Award for Outstanding Short-Form Comedy or Drama Series. Even the extended universe content that Gus touched turned into award-winning work. The performance itself changed Esposito's career in ways that are still unfolding. Before Breaking Bad, he had decades of well-regarded stage and screen work, but had not achieved the kind of broad cultural visibility that produces the particular kind of opportunity that follows it. After Gus Fring, he became a person that casting directors reach for when they need a very specific quality: the contained intelligence, the quiet menace, the authority communicated through stillness rather than volume. The Mandalorian cast him as Moff Gideon, an Imperial officer whose threat is established through composure and precision rather than displays of aggression. The Boys cast him as Stan Edgar, a corporate executive whose danger lies entirely in how little of what he is thinking he allows to reach his face. Both roles draw directly on the particular register that Gus Fring established, and that Esposito has now made definitively his own. The character's cultural life outside the shows themselves has been considerable. The concept of Los Pollos Hermanos as a real restaurant has been explored in promotional activations that have drawn significant attention, including pop-up restaurants that appeared in various cities around seasons of Better Call Saul, operating as genuine fast food experiences with the restaurant's branding and menu. The Los Pollos Hermanos employee training videos function in the way they were designed, as artifacts from a world in which the restaurant is a real place, with a real owner who genuinely cares about workplace standards. They are funny in a particular deadpan way, because the audience brings to them the knowledge of everything Gus is, and the videos treat him entirely as the reasonable, exacting restaurant manager he presents as publicly. The comedy is entirely structural, generated by the gap between what the audience knows and what the videos pretend. Gus Fring's confirmation as a gay man, established definitively by showrunner Peter Gould in 2022, added a dimension to the character's legacy that critics and writers have continued to engage with seriously. The representation of a gay character as a figure of this particular complexity, someone whose sexuality is neither a defining characteristic in the conventional sense, nor an incidental detail, but rather a buried and grief-organized aspect of an interior life that the story takes very seriously, was recognized as something genuinely unusual. His motivations, his entire criminal career, trace back to the murder of the man he loved. The empire was built on that love, and on the response to its loss. When that origin is understood as a love story, the character takes on an additional dimension of tragedy that his surface presentation was always designed to conceal. The critical consensus on what Gus Fring represents in the larger history of television writing tends to emphasize the sophistication of the design. Vince Gilligan and the Breaking Bad writing staff created him as a specific answer to a specific narrative problem. When Raymond Cruz, who played the volatile and explosive Tuco Salamanca, left the show at the end of Season 2 due to another commitment, the writers needed a new central antagonist for what would become the show's third and fourth seasons. The decision they made was to construct Tuco's opposite in every relevant dimension. Where Tuco was loud, Gus would be quiet. Where Tuco was impulsive, Gus would be patient. Where Tuco's danger was visible and immediately legible, Gus's would be invisible and require time to reveal. The character was conceived as a formal argument against the conventions of television villainy, an experiment in what happens when the antagonist is built from the inverse of every signal the genre uses to mark antagonists. The experiment produced something that outlasted its immediate narrative function. Gus Fring was supposed to be the big villain of Seasons 3 and 4. He became one of the defining characters of a decade of television, returned for an entire prequel series that gave him new dimensions without reducing the ones already established, and has continued to generate serious analytical attention years after the last scene featuring him aired. Characters that accomplish this tend to be characters that touched something real, that organized around a truth about human nature or human society in a way that made them feel like more than plot function. The truth Gus Fring touches is about the relationship between control and loss, about what a person becomes when the worst thing happens, and they respond to it not by breaking, but by building, by converting grief into architecture, and architecture into power, and power into the only form of forward movement available to someone who cannot go back and cannot stop. He is not sympathetic in any simple sense. The things he does are serious and harmful, and the show never asks the audience to forget that. But he is comprehensible, and the comprehension is uncomfortable in the particular way that the best dramatic writing tends to be uncomfortable, because the logic that produced him is not alien. It is recognizable. It is the logic of a person who was hurt very badly and responded by making sure they could never be hurt that way again, taken to an extreme that most people will never approach, but that most people can, if they are honest, find some version of in their own experience. That is what makes Gus Fring last. Television produces memorable antagonists with some regularity. It produces characters who are genuinely understood less often. Understanding requires that the character's interior life be real enough and accessible enough and organized around something true enough about the way people actually work that the audience can hold the character in mind as a person rather than as a function. Gus Fring achieves this despite, or perhaps because of, how little he directly reveals. The concealment is not evasion, it is characterization. The man behind the mask is present in every scene he is in, legible to anyone willing to look at what the mask is doing and ask what it is protecting. Half his face gone, and he straightens his tie. The discipline holds past the point where discipline can serve any purpose. The mask performs itself one last time, for no audience that matters, out of something that is no longer strategy and is only habit. The deepest kind of habit, the kind built over decades of practice and need. And then it releases, and Gustavo Fring goes down, and everything he built begins, without him, to come apart. The wound drove the plan built the empire concealed the wound, and in the end, the wound was what found him. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to subscribe, and I'll see you in the next video.